So sort of starting with, I suppose it's the issue of need. At the sort of present time, Birmingham as a city has been really hit by the impact of austerity. And what we're seeing is that there's already very high rates of child poverty in Ladywood, which is the constituency where I live. 42% of children are in poverty. We're just starting to see the impact of the welfare reforms, the changes in the social security system on families. There's already and remains quite high levels of unemployment. So overall, because we're 3 years into the current range of cuts and of this government, is that families are increasingly experiencing great levels of stress and pressure. And that will obviously have major impact on the welfare of children and the demand that they make on services. This year, in terms of the council budget, they're cutting about 20% of the cuts that have been made from the council budget have been made to children's services. It's about £21 million, and that's a very big chunk of money. There have been previous cuts in the previous 2 financial years, but this is quite an unprecedented level of cut. And what this sort of includes are cuts to mental health services for young people, closing children's homes, reducing the provision of the children's centres, just as a few of the examples, as well as some sort of major sort of changes in the way services are provided, but they use that as a way to cut and reduce services. So at a time of increasing need, we're also sort of seeing a significant contraction and reduction in the overall services that are available to children in the city. It's in terms of understanding the current cuts in children's services, it's actually important to have a sort of a longer view, and to go back really to 10 years to 2003, and to the Every Child Matters programme under the last Labour government. Now, although Every Child Matters is a bit of rhetoric, it was also it was significant because it was saying every young person in the population does have needs that should be met by the government in some shape or form. And what the last Labour government did was, one, they spent a lot of money. There was real investment in children's services, but their idea was to create a broad range of services for children, because they recognised that different children in the population, if they were to succeed, that they would have different levels of need and have different levels of support. So they created this sort of system, which has been described as a sort of a rainbow of services, starting with universal services, which would be open to all children, to preventative services, and at the end of the other rainbow would be services like safeguarding, which is where children are needing to be protected because of child protection issues, or they might be a family breakdown and they might need to be cared for by the local authority. But what they did was they built children's centres, Sure Starts, for the under 5s. They created a system of extended schools, where schools were an important sort of base for different services, such as after school, such as having family support workers in schools. So there was major investment there. They also then tried to integrate some of the services in terms of trying to get health professionals working alongside other professionals, and try to create partnership arrangements bringing together education, health, local authority, community and voluntary sector, to create effective sort of planning arrangements for developing services. So that's really quite significant. Now, moving forward to the present, the Every Child Matters agenda has been completely abandoned by this government, and sort of rejected. And it's not just a matter of making cuts and a commitment to making public spending cuts, but it's also driven politically and ideologically. This government doesn't believe in universal services. It believes in early intervention, and what's happened is in addition to reducing the total pot of money available for children's services, is they've then changed the way the services have been made. So a lot of the universal services, the preventative services, they're the ones that have been cut at this point of time. And some of the resources have then been diverted into the other types of intervention in terms of the safeguarding and other types of services as a way of managing the cuts. But what we're seeing now, because we're now in year 3 of this, well, it's 3.5 years of this government, are cuts to the social care services, to services like looked after children, hence the children's homes closures. And we're seeing a real tightening and hardening of what's a sort of a retrenched level of service. So one of the things that's actually happening in Birmingham is they're trying to create an early pathway in front of your safeguarding services. But this is a very different vision from the Every Child Matters framework. And currently they're trying to use the integrated family support teams and some of the community and voluntary sector services that they were going to cut. They've kept them alive to recommission them within the early pathway. But overall, there's a contraction of the range of services and types of resources available to families and children. One of the big difficulties is how they're making the cuts. When you look at, this is the budget document. When you look at the range and the types of cuts, you can sort of see that there's another 5 or 6 children's homes to be closed. But it's actually very difficult to understand and to actually explain how they're going to make the cuts. One of the devices that they've used is when they consulted on the budget in the period before February, up to February, what they didn't tell us a lot of detail. So what they have done in Birmingham is they've rolled over a lot of the cuts into service reviews, effectively delaying the decision about how cuts are going to be made. So big services like the children's centres, that's subject to a service review. The children's homes and the homes for children with disabilities. So there was a political sleight of hand, so that there wasn't a public debate in that critical period when the budget was actually being set. But a lot of the time, the cuts are not very direct, and it's very difficult to sort of explain the impact of the cuts on the service and on children and families receiving them. Using the example of the children's centres, this is a real political hot potato for them, because there's a children's centre virtually in every community in the city. Now, in the run-up, in November time, there was a revolt in the Labour group because £3 million was going to be cut from the children's centres, and they basically said, no, you're not going to do that. That's probably the only significant political opposition the leadership have had within the council. So what then happened was only £1 million is going to be cut from children's centres, but they then delayed the decision until the next financial year, because they didn't want to have the problem this year. But when you actually look at the current proposals, they're not talking about closing a particular children's centre, because they will know that will then become a focus for campaigning and for opposition. They've then created some very complicated formula to redistribute resources between children's centres. So that makes this very difficult for us in opposing the cuts, to say, look, this is what's going to happen here. So there's a real sort of science and technique as to how they're making the cuts as a way of preventing opposition.